Assalamualaikum everyone, this is Ara Shah and I hope you all are fine. So today is the second lecture of John Locke's Political Philosophy. In the last lecture we discussed introduction to Locke's philosophy, then we discussed about Locke's perception of human nature, later we discussed about his perception about the state of nature, and lastly we discussed that what was the nature of contract according to the Locke. So this lecture is a continuity of the last lecture, so let's start. So, starting with Locke's view about state and government, as we've discussed earlier, that according to Locke, the state it came into existence as a result of the contract. So, Locke believed that the state is superior than the government. He basically said that the state it constituted the people who were being ruled and those who were given the responsibility to rule. So, they both together constitute the state, but the government it only constituted the people who were entrusted with the responsibility to rule. So, in short, he basically distinguished between the state and the government, and he said that the state is superior than the government. Then he believed that the people has the right to revolt against the government, but they has no right to revolt against the state. Now, why to revolt against the government? So, according to him, that the natural rights of the people, in order to protect these natural rights, which are inviolable, it is the responsibility of the government. And if the government it fails to protect the natural rights of the people, so they deserve to be changed, and people can revolt against them and overthrow them. And in believing this concept, he basically supported the British people when they changed their government in 1688. So he totally justified that revolution. So talking about British Revolution of 1688, it is basically known as Glorious Revolution, and the cause of this revolution it stemmed from religious and political conflict. And at that time, King James II, he was the king of the Britain, and he was Catholic. So he had conflicts with the non-Catholic population. That's why people they overthrew him, and he was King James. He was basically replaced by his daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. So, Eugene Revolution it is also known as bloodless revolution in history. So, Locke, we were talking about that Locke he justified this because he believed that the people had the right to change their government if they fail to protect their natural rights, which is the responsibility of government according to him. Then Locke he emphasized on sovereign popular sovereignty. He did not talk about the legal sovereignty. So, what is the popular sovereignty? According to him, that after the contract, the community will be the sovereign, and the government it will work for specific purposes. And if the government it failed in doing their work, they then the people had the right to change the government. They had the right to revolt against it. That we have discussed previously. The right to revolt against the government. So he talked about the popular sovereignty. So now you're seeing that these points are basically interlinked. Firstly, he distinguished between the state and the government, and he said that the state is superior than the government. Then he said that people has no right to revolt against the state, but they has a right to revolt against the government if they fail to protect their rights. And thirdly, we have discussed that he emphasized on popular sovereignty, which is the sovereignty of the people after coming into the contract. And this sovereignty means that people can protest, people can revolt against the government if they are unable to protect their rights, and so people have the right to revolt. Then Locke he talked about limited government, and he opposed the idea of absolute sovereignty that we have discussed in Hobbes' theory, and he advocated the government based on divisions of power and subjected to the number of limitations. So, talking about this limitation, according to Locke, the government could not violate the natural rights of the people, and government will only work for people's interest. Then he said that the government it could not govern arbitrarily. It must govern according to the laws. And he said that the government could not tax the individuals without their consent, and according to him, the source of the power were the people. The laws of the government, according to him, should conform with the laws of the nature. And the government who failed to observe these limitations, according to him, that government was not worthy of obedience. So he basically rejected the idea of the absolute government, and he advocated the idea of the limited government. Then the Locke contract, or you can say Locke philosophy, it basically advocated the rule of the majority. So according to him, the law of nature could not be enforced by the state unless the minority submitted to the will of the majority. The majority had the right to act for the whole community. So in his state, it was the rule of the majority. Locke also advocated the constitutional state, and he depicted a state where the relationship between people and government, and the relationship between the people, means the relationship among themselves, it will be determined by the rule of law and not by the arbitrariness. So these were the points of Locke's view about state and government. So summarizing it, he talked about that the state was superior than the government. People can revolt against the government but not against the state. Thirdly, he said that the rule of the popular sovereignty. He said he didn't talk about the legal sovereignty, he talked about the popular sovereignty. Then he advocated the idea of limited government. In his state, it was the rule of the majority, and he talked about the constitutional state. So this was Locke's view about the state and government. Now we will discuss Locke's advocacy of limited and constitutional government. So Locke, he distinguished about the state and the government, and as we have discussed earlier in our previous lecture on John Locke, that according to Locke, two contracts were being made. By the first contract, a civil society was it came into existence, and that put an end to the state of nature, whereas by the second contract, a government was being created. So according to Locke, the government, they are only the deputies or trustees of the people who can be discarded if they fail, like we have discussed earlier, that the people has the right to revolt against the government, but they has no right to revolt against the state, and right only because if the government it fails to perform its duties, so people can overthrow them. So according to Locke, he basically wanted to subordinate the government to the community, and he said that the government exists for the good of the people, and it can be legitimately removed if the government failed to perform its duties. Now we will see that which form of government was best according to John Locke. So Locke, he described the supreme power of governments as the legislative authority. So if the legislative authority is in the hands of one man, it is monarchy, we all know that. If this legislative authority is vested in the hands of few selected persons by the consent of the majority, it is the aristocracy. And if the community it retains the legislative power in its own hands, and the community it appoints few officers for executing the laws, the government is a democracy. So these are the three forms of the governments: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. So which form of government was best according to the Locke? Locke basically considered a limited democracy in the hands of delegates controlled by election as the best form of the governance. So he talked about limited democracy. So what was the function of the government according to Locke? He said that he believed that the main object of people uniting into the state was the commonwealth, and putting themselves under the government was the preservation of the natural rights. So the main object, or you can say the main function of the government, was to protect the natural rights of the people. So all these things are interlinked, and this government it will work under certain limitation, like we have discussed before, that the government will work for public interest. It means their power is limited to the public good in the society. Secondly, he said that it must govern according to the laws. Then Locke said that the laws of the government should conform with the laws of the nature, and it could not govern arbitrarily, like we have discussed earlier. So basically, Locke advocated the constitutional government. Now we will discuss that what was the Locke's doctrine of consent. So the idea of consent it basically occupies a very important place in the political philosophy of John Locke. And he declared that the consent of the people is the basis of the government. Basically, he challenged the autocratic rule of the king by emphasizing that the government is to be run according to the consent of the people. अब autocratic rule क्या है? Autocratic rule, you must all know that it is basically the government in which the one person possess unlimited power, the authority, or you can say a rule of an autocrat. So he was against this autocratic rule, so he put forth his philosophy, because Locke wanted to place people's cause at high point. And according to Locke, people are the source of the political power, and the community it retains the supreme power. So he was basically the absolute form of the government. So here you can see the difference between the Hobbes and the Locke theory. Hobbes, he put forth the absolute form of government. He basically, you can say, advocated the absolutism, whereas Locke, he was against the autocratic rule. Then, talking further, before Montesquieu, Locke, he originated the theory of separation of powers and checks, and we will be talking about Montesquieu's philosophy in the coming lectures. And his philosophy is basically popular for his uh, pa- theory of separation of power and checks. So before Montesquieu, Locke, he originated the theory of separation of powers and checks and balances. He said that the legislature will control the executive, and legislature will be constituted by the representative of the people, and hence the popular will be expressed through the legislature. And according to Locke, this legislative power it will be limited to the public good of the society, and when a government it does something contrary to the public good or it violates the law of nature, it must be overthrown by the popular revolt. वही बात दोबारा जो है वो रिपीट हो रही है कि if the government it fails to perform its duty, then the people has a right to revolt. So यहाँ पे आप देख सकते हैं कि we have linked Locke's philosophy with the Hobbes, and then we have talked about the separation of power and checks and balances, which is the basically the main idea of the philosophy of Montesquieu. So before Montesquieu, you can relate it like this: that before Montesquieu, Locke basically gave the concept of separation of power and checks and balance. So, in short, in Locke's philosophy, the sovereignty it vested in the community, and Locke repudiated the sovereignty of the Hobbes. So this is the basic difference between the Hobbes and Locke. In the coming lectures, we will discuss in detail about Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau. When we will talk about Rousseau philosophy, we will then differentiate between the three in detail. Now let's discuss that what was the criticism on Locke's philosophy. So Locke's social contract it is basically unrealistic, and a social contract that Locke explained it almost never has happened. Secondly, Locke's social contract theory is backward looking, and it basically aims to preserve the rights we had already had in the state of nature. And the major flaw is that it does not aim to allow new government to improve the social conditions if they contradict those backward looking rights that we had in the state of nature. And another criticism on Locke's philosophy is that it is basically elitist. Elitist means that it is biased towards those who have property or who have work for, or you can say who have inherited the property, because while everyone has a right to property, so the greater benefits of the property ownership will fall only to those who have the property. So it was the major criticism on Locke's philosophy. Locke philosophy, in short, is more hard-hearted than the Hobbes philosophy, because in Hobbes, according to Hobbes, at least if you are starving, you have the right to distress, and you have the justification of stealing. Like if you are starving and you steal something, so you have the justification for it, that you have done it in order to sustain, in order to protect your life. But according to Locke, the right to property is the absolute as the right to life. So because of this reason, you cannot steal, according to him, you cannot steal someone's property to allow you to exercise, or you can say you can, in order to continue your right to life. So it is basically hard-hearted philosophy. So this was all about Locke's philosophy. I hope it is clear. If you have any questions regarding it, you can ask in the comment section. And if you, or you can join my WhatsApp group. You can ask any question regarding CSS and PMS. In the coming lecture, we will discuss Rousseau, and then we will talk about the difference between the Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau's philosophy, which is the major question that is often asked in the political science paper in CSS. And if you has any issue regarding English, or you have any issue regarding any subject, you can ask in the WhatsApp group. I will share the link in the description box, and kindly like it and do share with your fellows, so that they can benefit from these videos if they are preparing for CSS at home. Thank you for watching. Allah Hafiz.